The rain hammered against the windshield of the battered supply truck as it climbed the narrow mountain road somewhere in southern Italy, autumn of 1943. Behind the wheel sat Frank Morrison, a 38-year-old civilian contractor from Pennsylvania, his calloused hands gripping the steering wheel with practiced ease. The convoy behind him stretched for miles, military vehicles loaded with ammunition, food and medical supplies desperately needed at the front lines. Frank had been driving trucks since he was 16, hauling coal through the Appalachian Mountains, navigating impossible roads that would make most drivers quit on their first day. Now that same skill was keeping Allied forces supplied in one of the most brutal campaigns of the war. If you're enjoying this story, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring you more incredible true stories like this one. The mud was getting worse. Frank could feel the truck's wheels fighting for traction on the rain-soaked mountain road. Behind him, through the side mirror streaked with water, he watched as a military supply truck struggled with the same conditions, its inexperienced driver grinding gears and jerking the vehicle forward in fits and starts. Frank had noticed this pattern for weeks now. Young soldiers, barely trained to drive on flat parade grounds, were being thrown into mountain warfare conditions with vehicles they didn't understand. The result was damaged transmissions, burned-out clutches, and worst of all, supplies that never reached the men who needed them. Frank had tried to mention it to a few junior officers, but they'd dismissed him politely. He was just a civilian after all. What could he possibly teach the United States Army? The convoy stopped for the night at a forward operating base carved into the hillside. Frank climbed down from his truck, his joints stiff from 12 hours of driving. The base was a muddy collection of tents, supply dumps, and exhausted men trying to grab whatever rest they could before the next push forward. He walked toward the mess tent, nodding to soldiers who recognized him from previous runs. That's when he heard the shouting. Near the motor pool, a captain was berating a young private whose truck had broken down just outside the base perimeter. The kid couldn't have been more than 19, his face pale with exhaustion and fear. The truck behind him had a smoking engine, clearly overheated from being driven too hard in the wrong gear. Frank knew exactly what had happened. The boy had been riding the clutch and over-revving the engine, trying to maintain speed on the incline. A common mistake for drivers who didn't understand the relationship between gear ratios and engine stress. Frank approached cautiously. Military men didn't always appreciate civilian interference, but he couldn't watch this kid get torn apart for a problem that could have been prevented with proper training. The captain, a tall man with iron-gray hair and a face weathered by too many battles, turned to glare at him. His name tag read, Thompson. "Excuse me, sir. I don't mean to interrupt, but I might be able to help with the vehicle situation." Frank kept his voice respectful but firm. Captain Thompson's eyes narrowed. "And you are?" "Frank Morrison, civilian contractor. I've been hauling supplies through these mountains since we landed. I used to drive in conditions just like this back in Pennsylvania." The captain looked him up and down, clearly unimpressed. "We have trained military drivers, Mr. Morrison. I think we can handle our own vehicles. With respect, sir, that truck wasn't trained to death. It was driven to death. Wrong gear selection for the load and gradient. The kid didn't know any better because nobody taught him how to read a mountain road." The young private looked like he wanted to disappear into the mud. Several other soldiers had stopped to watch the exchange. Captain Thompson's jaw tightened, but something in Frank's tone must have caught his attention because he didn't immediately dismiss him. "You think you could do better? I think I could teach your drivers to do better. These boys know how to drive, but they don't know how to drive heavy vehicles through mountain terrain under combat conditions. There's a technique to it: weight distribution, gear selection, reading the road surface, managing momentum. I've been doing it for 20 years. Captain Thompson was silent for a long moment, studying Frank's face. Finally he spoke. "You have until tomorrow morning to prove that." If you can show me something worth teaching, I'll consider it. If you're wasting my time, you can explain to Colonel Barnes why civilian contractors are interfering with military operations." Frank nodded. Fair enough. The next morning, before dawn, Frank gathered a small group of drivers that Captain Thompson had selected. There were 6 of them. Young men with nervous energy and doubtful expressions. They stood in the motor pool while Frank walked around a fully loaded supply truck, identical to the ones they drove every day. The first thing you need to understand is that these trucks aren't cars. They don't respond the same way, they don't handle the same way, and if you treat them like cars, you'll burn them out or get them stuck or worse. Frank patted the truck's hood. This vehicle is a tool, and like any tool, you need to know how to use it properly. He opened the driver's door and gestured to the gear shift. How many of you downshift before you hit a steep incline? A few hands went up uncertainly. Frank nodded. How many of you wait until you're already climbing and the engine starts to struggle? More hands this time. Frank climbed into the driver's seat. That's the problem. By the time the engine struggles, you're already losing momentum, which means you have to work the engine harder to recover, which burns fuel, wears out the transmission, and can leave you stuck halfway up a mountain with supplies that never reach the front. Watch. He started the truck and drove it toward a test hill they'd identified the night before, a steep, muddy incline just outside the base perimeter. The young drivers followed in a second truck. Frank narrated every action as he approached the hill. I'm reading the road ahead. I can see it's steep and the surface is wet. That tells me traction is limited and I'll need sustained power, not sudden bursts. So I'm downshifting now before the incline, while I still have level ground and momentum. Listen to the engine. The truck's engine note changed as Frank smoothly shifted down, matching the gear to the upcoming challenge rather than reacting to it. Now I'm entering the hill at a steady speed in the right gear. The engine has plenty of power reserve. The wheels maintain traction because I'm not asking them to suddenly grip and pull harder, and I can focus on steering and reading the surface rather than fighting the transmission. The truck climbed the hill smoothly, steadily, without drama. Frank brought it back down and turned to the young soldiers. Your turn. For the next 3 hours, Frank worked with each driver individually. He taught them to read road surfaces by observing water patterns and mud consistency. He showed them how to feel through the steering wheel when traction was about to break. He demonstrated weight distribution techniques for navigating switchbacks with heavy loads. Most importantly, he taught them to think ahead, to anticipate challenges rather than react to them. Captain Thompson watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. When Frank finally wrapped up the session covered in mud but satisfied, Thompson approached. That was impressive, Mr. Morrison. But can it work at scale? We have hundreds of drivers, thousands of vehicles. This isn't a Pennsylvania coal route. This is a military supply line under enemy fire. Frank met his gaze steadily. Then let me train your drivers properly. Give me 2 weeks with your motor pool instructors. I'll teach them everything I know. They can incorporate it into your standard training, and every driver who comes through will have these skills. It'll save you vehicles, save you time, and save you lives when supplies actually reach the men who need them. Thompson considered this for a long moment. Around them, the base hummed with activity, preparation for another push toward the German defensive lines. Finally, he nodded. I'll take it to Colonel Barnes. But Morrison, if you're wrong about this, if it doesn't work in real combat conditions, we're done. Understood? Understood, sir. 3 days later, Frank found himself standing in a briefing tent in front of Colonel Barnes and his senior staff. The colonel was a compact man with sharp eyes and the bearing of someone who'd spent 30 years in the military. He listened without interruption as Frank explained his proposal, using a chalkboard to diagram gear ratios, weight distribution, and terrain analysis techniques. When Frank finished, there was silence. Then one of the majors, a man named Hendricks, with a skeptical expression, spoke up. With all due respect, Colonel, this sounds like basic driving instruction. Our men receive adequate training before deployment. We're fighting a war, not running a trucking school. Frank kept his voice level. Your men receive adequate training for standard conditions, sir. But these aren't standard conditions. The Italian mountains are some of the most challenging terrain in Europe. The roads weren't built for heavy military traffic. The weather is unpredictable, and the enemy controls the high ground. Every vehicle that breaks down is a strategic loss. Every supply run that fails means soldiers at the front go without ammunition or food. I'm not questioning your training program. I'm trying to enhance it for the specific conditions we're facing. Colonel Barnes tapped his fingers on the table. How long would this training take? We can't pull drivers off active duty for weeks of instruction. 2 weeks for your motor pool instructors and senior sergeants. They can then integrate the techniques into your existing training pipeline. After that, maybe half a day of practical instruction for each active driver, done in small groups during regular maintenance rotations. Minimal disruption to operations. Another officer, a captain named Rodriguez, leaned forward. What's your success rate with this method, Morrison? Do you have data? 22 years driving heavy vehicles through Appalachian Mountains without a single serious accident or mechanical failure due to driving error. I can't give you military data because this hasn't been tested in military conditions yet. That's what I'm asking, for the chance to prove. Colonel Barnes stood and walked to the tent entrance, looking out at the sprawling base. When he turned back, his expression was thoughtful. Captain Thompson tells me your demonstration was convincing. Major Hendricks, I want you to work with Morrison. Set up a pilot program with 40 drivers, mixed experience levels. 2 weeks of training, then evaluate the results. If Morrison's techniques reduce vehicle breakdowns and improve supply delivery times, we'll roll it out division-wide. If not, we thank him for his time and move on. Agreed? The staff officers nodded, though Major Hendricks still looked dubious. Frank felt a knot of tension ease in his chest. He had his chance. The next 2 weeks were brutal. Frank worked from dawn until well past dark, training motor pool instructors who ranged from enthusiastic to openly hostile. Some of the older sergeants resented being taught by a civilian. Others, particularly those who'd grown up in rural areas and understood vehicles intuitively, grasped the concepts immediately and became advocates. Sergeant Mike Walsh, a wiry man from Montana who'd grown up on a ranch, became Frank's strongest ally. He understood mountain driving instinctively and helped translate Frank's civilian terminology into military doctrine. Together, they developed a structured curriculum that could be taught consistently across the division. The practical training was where the resistance really showed. Frank would take groups of drivers to the proving ground, a stretch of mountain road that had been secured but still featured all the challenges of the actual supply routes. He'd demonstrate a technique, then watch as drivers attempted it, often failing multiple times before the concept clicked. One afternoon, Frank was working with a particularly stubborn driver named Kowalski, a kid from Chicago who drove with urban aggressiveness, completely unsuited to mountain roads. He kept gunning the engine and fighting the steering wheel, trying to force the truck to do what he wanted rather than working with the vehicle and terrain. Kowalski, stop. Frank held up his hand. The young soldier hit the brakes hard, sending the truck into a slight skid on the muddy surface. See, that's exactly what I'm talking about. You're fighting everything. The truck, the road, the mud. You need to work with them. I am working with them. Kowalski's voice was frustrated. I'm doing what you said. You're doing the actions, but you're not thinking the way. You're still approaching this like city driving, all reactions and quick inputs. Mountain driving with heavy loads is about anticipation and smooth inputs. Try it again. But this time, before you do anything, tell me what you see ahead and what you're planning to do about it. Kowalski sighed, but nodded. He started the truck again and eased forward. Ahead, there's a curve to the right. Looks like it tightens up and the surface is wetter on the outside of the turn. Good. What does that tell you? I should take it slower and stay toward the inside of the turn where there's better traction. Exactly. Now what gear should you be in for that? Kowalski thought for a moment. Lower than what I'm in now. So I have more control and don't have to brake hard in the turn. Now you're thinking like a mountain driver. Do it. This time, Kowalski's execution was smoother. He downshifted early, reduced speed before the turn, and navigated the curve without drama. When he straightened out on the far side, there was a new expression on his face, something like understanding. By the end of the first week, Frank could see real progress. Vehicle breakdowns in the training group had dropped noticeably. More importantly, drivers were starting to think differently about their vehicles and the roads. They asked questions, discussed techniques among themselves, and approached challenging conditions with analysis rather than just determination. But the real test came at the start of the second week, when Major Hendricks announced they'd be conducting a practical evaluation. 2 convoys would run the same supply route, one using standard driving techniques and one using Frank's methods. Same vehicles, same loads, same road conditions. The results would determine whether the program continued. Frank felt the weight of that challenge. If his convoy failed, if vehicles broke down or got stuck, the entire program would be scrapped. All the work, all the training, would be dismissed as a civilian's fantasy about what military operations required. The day of the evaluation dawned cold and misty. Frank stood in the motor pool watching both convoys prepare. The control group, using standard military driving techniques, consisted of experienced drivers who'd been running these routes for months. Frank's group had drivers with mixed experience levels, all of whom had completed his training program. Captain Thompson approached, his expression neutral. The route is 28 miles, mostly mountain roads, 3 significant climbs, multiple switchbacks. Current intelligence says the roads are muddy but passable. Weather forecast calls for rain starting around noon. Both convoys leave at 0800. Any questions? Frank shook his head. We're ready. The convoys departed simultaneously, taking slightly different routes that converged at the supply depot. Frank rode in the lead truck of his convoy, driven by Sergeant Walsh, with instructions to observe but not interfere. Behind them, 15 trucks carried full loads of supplies. The first climb came 5 miles in. Frank watched as Walsh executed the approach perfectly, downshifting early, maintaining steady momentum, reading the road surface for the best traction. Behind them, the other trucks followed suit, spacing themselves properly to avoid bunching up if someone had trouble. They crested the hill smoothly and continued on. Over the radio, they could hear updates from the control convoy. They were making good time, but had already had one truck lose traction on the same climb, requiring assistance from other vehicles to continue. Small delay, but significant. By noon, the rain started as predicted. The road surface degraded quickly, mud turning slick and treacherous. This was where Frank's training would really matter. He watched Walsh adjust his driving, reducing speed slightly, increasing following distance, choosing lines through puddles that indicated harder surface underneath rather than deep mud. A call came over the radio. One of the trucks in Frank's convoy, driven by Kowalski, was reporting difficulty on a particularly steep switchback. Frank grabbed the radio. Kowalski, this is Morrison. What's your situation? The kid's voice came back tight with stress. I'm on the 3rd switchback on the western climb. Surface is real slick. I'm in 2nd gear, but the back end is sliding. Frank closed his eyes, visualizing the switchback from memory. Okay, listen carefully. You're loaded heavy, which means you have weight, which means you have traction if you use it right. Don't fight the slide. Ease off the throttle, let the truck slow naturally, and steer into the slide gently. Once you feel the wheels bite, maintain that exact throttle position and let momentum carry you through. Don't accelerate until you're completely out of the turn. There was silence for a moment. Frank could picture Kowalski processing the instructions, fighting his instinct to do something dramatic. Then the radio crackled again. "Copy that. Trying it now." Another pause, longer this time. Frank exchanged glances with Walsh, who kept his eyes on the road but was clearly listening. Then Kowalski's voice returned, audibly relieved. "That worked. I'm through. Continuing on. Good job. Remember that feeling. That's what control feels like in these conditions." The control convoy wasn't faring as well. Radio chatter indicated they'd had 2 trucks slide off the road, requiring recovery, and one with a burned-out clutch from a driver trying to power through a steep section in too high a gear. They were falling further behind schedule. By 1400 hours, Frank's convoy reached the supply depot. All 15 trucks arrived intact, on schedule, with no mechanical failures. They began unloading immediately. The control convoy arrived 40 minutes later, down 3 trucks that had to be left along the route for recovery and repair. Major Hendricks was waiting at the depot, clipboard in hand, his expression carefully neutral as he took notes. Colonel Barnes arrived an hour later, reviewed the data, and asked to speak with Frank privately. They walked away from the busy depot to a quiet area overlooking the valley. Below them, supply trucks continued their endless shuttle between rear areas and the front lines. Colonel Barnes was silent for a long moment, studying the landscape. "My father was a farmer in Iowa. He taught me that there's a difference between knowing how to do something and understanding why you're doing it. Your training program teaches understanding, not just actions. That's rare in military instruction, Mr. Morrison. We're very good at drilling people to follow procedures, but we don't always teach them to think about why those procedures work or how to adapt when conditions change." Frank remained quiet, letting the colonel continue. "Major Hendricks was skeptical of your program, as you probably noticed, but he's also honest enough to admit when he's wrong. Your convoy outperformed the control group in every metric: faster delivery time, 0 mechanical failures, better fuel efficiency, and most importantly, your drivers handled unexpected situations better. They adapted instead of breaking. That's what wins wars, Mr. Morrison. Adaptation." The colonel turned to face him. "I'm authorizing division-wide implementation of your training program. You'll work with our training command to formalize the curriculum, train additional instructors, and oversee the rollout. This will be designated the Morrison Method in official documentation, and you'll receive full credit. I'm also requesting that you remain attached to this division for the duration of the Italian campaign. Your expertise is too valuable to waste on standard contract driving. Will you accept?" Frank felt something tighten in his chest. He thought about his wife back in Pennsylvania, waiting for letters that came irregularly. He thought about his own trucking business, currently being run by his brother. But he also thought about Kowalski's voice over the radio, the relief when the technique worked. He thought about all the young drivers who die in accidents or cost soldiers their supplies if someone didn't teach them properly. "I'll accept, sir, on one condition." Barnes raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead." "The training can't be just about vehicle operation. These kids need to understand maintenance too. Half the breakdowns I've seen could have been prevented if drivers knew how to do basic checks and spot problems before they became critical. Let me add a maintenance component to the training." The colonel smiled slightly, agreed. "Work with our motor pool sergeants on that. They'll appreciate a civilian who respects what they do." Over the next 3 months, the Morrison Method spread through the division. Frank trained over 200 instructors, who then trained thousands of drivers. The results were undeniable. Vehicle breakdown rates dropped by 40%. Supply delivery times improved by an average of 15%. Most importantly, driver casualties from accidents decreased significantly. But success brought new challenges. As word of the program spread, Frank found himself dealing with military bureaucracy. Other divisions wanted to implement the training. Higher command wanted detailed reports and documentation. Some officers resented that a civilian program was being integrated into official military doctrine. There was also resistance from unexpected quarters. A few veteran drivers, particularly those who'd managed to survive the early chaos of the Italian campaign through sheer determination and luck, saw the training as an implicit criticism of their methods. One sergeant, a man named Paulson, with 3 years of military driving experience, confronted Frank after a training session. "You think you're better than us, Morrison? Coming in here with your civilian ideas, acting like we don't know how to do our jobs." Frank kept his voice calm. "I think you're survivors, Sergeant Paulson. You figured out how to stay alive in impossible conditions with inadequate preparation. That's admirable. But why should every driver have to learn the hard way? Why should we lose good men and equipment because nobody taught them techniques that could keep them safe?" Paulson's expression remained hostile. "Military driving isn't the same as civilian trucking. We operate under fire. We don't have the luxury of taking things slow and careful." "No, you don't. Which is exactly why you need to be more efficient with the time you have. Every minute wasted fighting a truck that's in the wrong gear or stuck in mud because of poor line choice is a minute you're exposed to enemy fire. My methods aren't about being slow, they're about being smooth and efficient so you can complete missions faster and with less risk." Something in Paulson's expression shifted slightly. Frank pressed on. "I'm not here to take credit or make anyone look bad. I'm here because good kids are dying in accidents that don't have to happen, and supplies aren't reaching men who need them because vehicles are breaking down unnecessarily. If you have better techniques, I want to learn them. This isn't about ego, it's about winning the war." Paulson was silent for a moment, then nodded curtly. "Fair enough. But you better be right about this, Morrison." In December of 1943, the division pushed forward in a major offensive toward the German defensive positions known as the Winter Line. Frank's techniques were about to face their most severe test under actual combat conditions. Supply convoys had to navigate mountain roads under artillery fire, with enemy positions overlooking key routes. Frank wasn't driving combat supply runs anymore. His role had evolved into oversight and problem-solving, but when he heard that a critical supply convoy was assembling for a particularly dangerous run, he volunteered to ride along. Captain Thompson, now promoted to major after successful operations that his well-supplied units had executed, tried to talk him out of it. "Morrison, you've proven your point. You don't need to risk your life on this run. We have trained drivers who can handle it." Frank shook his head. "Those drivers learned from instructors who learned from me. I need to see how the techniques hold up under fire, under real pressure. If there are flaws, I need to identify them before they cost lives." Thompson studied him for a moment, then sighed. "You're a stubborn man, Frank Morrison. Always were. All right, but you follow my orders out there. If I tell you to take cover, you take cover. Understood?" "Understood." The convoy assembled at 0400 under a moonless sky. 20 trucks, each loaded with ammunition, medical supplies, and food for units engaged in heavy fighting 12 miles ahead. The route passed through contested territory with German artillery positions that had shelled previous convoys. Frank rode in the third truck with Sergeant Walsh at the wheel. Behind them, Kowalski drove the fourth truck, his earlier struggles transformed into solid competence through practice and training. The convoy moved out in darkness, headlights blacked out, drivers navigating by moonlight and familiarity with the road. The first artillery shell fell when they were 6 miles in, exploding in the forest to their left. Not a direct targeting, but a ranging shot, the Germans probing for the convoy they knew was coming. Major Thompson's voice came over the radio, calm and professional. "All vehicles increase speed to maximum safe rate. Execute evasive spacing. Stay on the road." This was where Frank's training showed its real value. The drivers didn't panic, they didn't race or bunch up. They smoothly increased speed while maintaining proper following distance, spreading the convoy out to make it harder to target. Each driver read the road ahead, choosing the fastest safe line through the darkness, engines in the right gear to maximize power without sacrificing control. More shells fell, walking up the hillside toward the road. The Germans were adjusting their fire. Frank gripped the door handle as Walsh navigated a tight switchback at speed, the truck's tires finding purchase on the muddy surface because Walsh had positioned the vehicle perfectly, weight distributed correctly, throttle smooth and steady. A shell hit the road ahead, the explosion lighting up the night. Walsh braked hard but controlled, downshifting to maintain engine braking, steering around the crater without leaving the road surface. Behind them, Kowalski followed the same line, then the next truck, each driver adapting to the changed conditions without losing momentum. They were through the worst of the artillery zone in minutes, faster than previous convoys, but with no vehicles lost to accidents or getting stuck. The convoy pressed on, climbing into the hills where friendly forces waited desperately for resupply. When they reached the forward area and began unloading, a lieutenant approached Frank, his face smudged with dirt and exhaustion. "You're Morrison, the truck training guy?" Frank nodded, helping unload crates of ammunition. "I heard about your program. Thought it was probably bureaucratic nonsense, honestly. But watching your drivers come up that road under fire, the way they moved, the speed and control, that was something else. That's going to save lives." The convoy made the return trip without incident, arriving back at base as dawn broke over the mountains. Frank climbed down from Walsh's truck, his body aching with fatigue, and found Major Thompson waiting. 0 vehicle losses, 0 accidents, fastest supply delivery time on record for that route. The frontline units are fully resupplied. Morrison, your techniques just proved themselves under the worst possible conditions. Whatever doubts anyone had, they're gone now. Frank felt a wave of relief and exhaustion wash over him. Good, that's good. But Thompson wasn't finished. "I received orders this morning. High Command wants you in Rome. They're implementing the Morrison method across all Allied forces in Italy. Every division, every supply unit. You're going to train the trainers at a centralized facility. This is bigger than one division now." Frank looked out at the motor pool, where tired drivers were performing post-mission maintenance checks, exactly as he'd taught them, looking for problems before they became failures. He thought about all the kids who wouldn't die in accidents now, all the soldiers who'd receive supplies because trucks didn't break down. It felt too large to comprehend. "When do I leave?" 3 days. They're setting up the facility now. "But Frank," Thompson's expression was serious, "this is going to mean less fieldwork, more administration and politics. High Command, inter-allied coordination, documentation. It's important work, but it's different from what you've been doing. Are you ready for that?" Frank thought about his wife's last letter, received 2 weeks ago, telling him how proud she was, but asking when he'd be home. He thought about his business, his life before the war. But he also thought about every driver who'd thanked him, every officer who'd seen the difference proper training made, every soldier who'd received supplies because a convoy made it through. "I'm ready. Whatever it takes to make this work, to make sure every driver has the training they need, I'm ready." The training facility was established in a former Italian military academy outside Rome. Frank found himself working with British, Canadian and Free French forces, adapting his techniques to different vehicle types and operational doctrines. It was challenging work, complicated by language barriers and differing military cultures, but the fundamental principles remained the same. One afternoon, Frank was demonstrating techniques to a group of British instructors when a staff car pulled up. A colonel emerged, followed by someone Frank recognized from newspapers and newsreels. General Harold Alexander, commander of Allied forces in Italy. Everyone snapped to attention. The general waved them at ease and walked over to Frank. "Mr. Morrison, I've read the reports on your training program. 40% reduction in vehicle failures, 15% improvement in supply delivery times, significant reduction in driver casualties. Those aren't just statistics, they're the difference between success and failure in modern warfare. I wanted to meet the man responsible and see the training firsthand. Please, continue with your demonstration. Frank swallowed his surprise and returned to teaching. For the next hour, he walked the British instructors through advanced techniques for handling heavy vehicles in mud, demonstrating how to read surface conditions and adjust driving style accordingly. General Alexander watched intently, occasionally asking questions that showed he understood the implications beyond just vehicle operation. When the demonstration concluded, Alexander pulled Frank aside. "You've made a significant contribution to this war effort, Mr. Morrison, more than many officers with far more rank and recognition. I'm recommending you for a civilian commendation, and I'm also ensuring that your training program becomes part of standard Allied doctrine. After the war, the military needs to remember these lessons. Too often we have to relearn everything when the next conflict comes. Your work will be documented and preserved." Frank felt humbled. "Thank you, sir. I just wanted to help however I could." Alexander smiled. "That's what makes the difference, Morrison. You saw a problem, you had a solution, and you persisted until someone listened. The military doesn't always welcome outside input, but the good officers, the ones who actually want to win, they recognize expertise regardless of where it comes from. You proved that. The war in Italy ground on through 1944. Frank continued training instructors as Allied forces pushed slowly north against determined German resistance. His techniques spread throughout the theater, then to other fronts as officers who'd served in Italy were transferred to France after D-Day and into Germany in the final pushes of the war. The training facility expanded significantly as spring turned to summer. What had started as a small program for one division had grown into a multinational training center processing hundreds of drivers each week. Frank found himself managing a staff of 30 instructors from 4 different Allied nations, each bringing their own perspective and challenges to the work. The French instructors, many of them veterans of the disastrous 1940 campaign, were initially skeptical. They'd seen their country fall, despite having what many considered superior military doctrine. A tall captain named Dubois challenged Frank during one of the early coordination meetings. "Monsieur Morrison, the French army had extensive driver training before the war, yet we were defeated in 6 weeks. What makes you think better driving techniques would have changed anything?" Frank met his gaze steadily. "Captain, I can't speak to grand strategy or what happened in 1940. But I can tell you that when supplies don't reach the front because trucks break down, when ammunition runs dry because convoys can't navigate the roads, armies lose, regardless of how good their tactics are. Your country is fighting to liberate itself right now, and every truck that makes it through means French soldiers have what they need to keep fighting. That's what I can help with." Dubois considered this, then nodded slowly. "Very well. Show us what you have, and we will judge its merit." The French instructors proved to be quick learners and excellent teachers once convinced. Dubois himself became one of Frank's strongest advocates, adapting the techniques for the different driving styles and vehicle types used by Free French forces. He brought a precision to the instruction that complemented Frank's practical approach. The Canadian instructors were more immediately receptive. Many of them came from rural backgrounds, farming and logging communities where understanding machinery was essential for survival. A sergeant named Mackenzie from Nova Scotia reminded Frank of the Pennsylvania coal haulers he'd grown up around, men who could diagnose a mechanical problem by sound and feel alone. Mackenzie approached Frank one evening after a particularly long training day. "You know, Morrison, what you're teaching isn't really about trucks at all. It's about reading situations, understanding systems, staying calm when things go wrong. That's useful for a lot more than just driving. Frank smiled. You're right. I've been thinking the same thing. The principles work because they're about clear thinking under pressure. That applies to almost anything in a war. This conversation sparked an idea that Frank discussed with Major Thompson during his next visit to the facility. What if they expanded the training beyond just vehicle operation? What if they taught the same analytical approach to other aspects of military logistics, equipment maintenance, supply chain management, even tactical planning? Thompson was intrigued, but cautious. You're talking about a much broader program, Frank. That would require buy-in from senior command, coordination across multiple branches. It's a bigger lift than what we've done so far. But it's the same principle, Frank argued. Anticipate rather than react. Understand systems well enough to work with them efficiently. Break complex problems into manageable parts. Why limit that to driving? The conversation led to a proposal that Frank drafted with help from Thompson and several senior logistics officers. They called it the Adaptive Operations Training Program, using the Morrison method as a proof of concept for teaching systematic problem-solving across military operations. The proposal made its way up the chain of command through the summer of 1944. Meanwhile, the original driver training continued to show results. Reports came in from divisions across Italy and from the newly opened front in France. Vehicle breakdown rates were down across the board wherever the Morrison method had been implemented. More significantly, supply delivery times had improved enough that offensive operations could be sustained with fewer total vehicles, freeing up resources for other needs. A British logistics colonel named Pemberton visited the facility in August. He'd been skeptical of the program initially, viewing it as another American enthusiasm that would fade once the novelty wore off. But the data had changed his mind. Morrison, I owe you an apology. When I first heard about your training program, I thought it was much ado about nothing. We've been driving vehicles for decades after all. How much could possibly be improved? But the numbers don't lie. The divisions using your methods are significantly more efficient. You've managed to do what most military reformers failed to accomplish. You've changed behavior in a measurable, positive way. Frank appreciated the acknowledgement, but remained focused on the work. There's still room for improvement, Colonel. We're learning new things every week as drivers encounter different conditions and share their experiences. The method has to keep evolving. Pemberton nodded approvingly. That's the mark of good doctrine, Morrison. It's flexible enough to adapt while maintaining core principles. Tell me, have you considered what happens after the war? This knowledge shouldn't be lost. Frank hadn't thought much beyond the immediate need. The war consumed everything, made it hard to imagine a world beyond the conflict. But Pemberton's question stuck with him. What would happen to all this accumulated knowledge once the fighting stopped? The military would demobilize, trained drivers would return to civilian life, and institutions would focus on other priorities. How could they ensure the lessons learned wouldn't be forgotten? He raised the question at a staff meeting later that week. The instructors, representing 4 nations and diverse military backgrounds, had varying perspectives. Some thought documentation was sufficient, detailed manuals and training films that could be archived. Others argued for institutionalizing the training in permanent military schools. A young American lieutenant named Sanders suggested something different. What if we trained civilian instructors too? After the war, all these drivers are going to go back to hauling goods in the civilian economy. Imagine if that entire generation of drivers had this training. It would improve transportation safety and efficiency across society, not just in the military. The idea resonated with Frank. He'd always believed that the principles he taught had value beyond military applications. A truck driver on a Pennsylvania mountain road faced many of the same challenges as a military driver in Italy, just without the artillery fire. Why shouldn't civilian drivers benefit from these techniques? He began working on a proposal for post-war civilian driver training, using the Morrison method as a foundation for commercial vehicle operation. It would be a massive undertaking, requiring coordination with state governments, trucking companies, and driver training schools. But if it could save even a fraction of the lives lost to commercial vehicle accidents each year, it would be worth the effort. Frank received letters from drivers he'd trained, thanking him for skills that had saved their lives. He received reports from logistics officers showing continued improvement in supply efficiency. But he also received the harder letters, notifications that drivers he knew had been killed in combat or accidents despite the training. It was a reminder that no technique, no matter how good, could guarantee survival in war. One letter hit particularly hard. It came from the family of a young driver named Peters, a kid from Ohio who'd been in one of Frank's first training groups. Peters had been killed when his convoy was ambushed, but his commanding officer had written to say that Peters' driving had saved 3 other trucks, his quick thinking and skilled vehicle control creating an escape route under fire. The family wanted Frank to know that the training he'd provided had given their son the tools to save others, even as he lost his own life. Frank kept that letter in his desk drawer, reading it whenever he felt discouraged by the bureaucracy and politics of running a large training operation. It reminded him why the work mattered, why every hour spent teaching or refining curriculum or fighting for resources was worth it. The facility received a visit in September from General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Europe. His inspection was part of a broader tour of logistics operations, but Frank had been told Eisenhower wanted to see the Morrison method training personally. The general arrived with minimal fanfare, accompanied only by a small staff. He watched a training session where instructors were teaching advanced techniques for operating in winter conditions, preparing drivers for the approaching cold months in the mountains. Eisenhower asked pointed questions about scalability, sustainability, and how the training integrated with overall logistics doctrine. Afterward, he spoke with Frank privately in the facility's small office. "Mr. Morrison, I've read the reports on your program. The efficiency gains are significant, but what impresses me more is the cultural change. You've taught people to think differently about problems. That's rare in military organizations. We're good at following doctrine, but not always at adapting it. Your work challenges that in a productive way." Frank wasn't sure how to respond to praise from someone of Eisenhower's stature. "Thank you, sir. I just tried to share what I'd learned over the years." Eisenhower smiled. "That's precisely the point. The military often overlooks practical expertise in favor of theoretical knowledge, but wars are won by people who know how to actually do things, not just people who know about them. You've reminded us of that. I'm authorizing expansion of your training program to all forces under my command. That includes the divisions preparing for the push into Germany. Your techniques will be taught to every driver in the European theater." Are you prepared for that scale of operation? Frank felt the weight of that responsibility. "Sir, I'll need more instructors, more resources, probably a larger facility. But yes, we can do it. You'll have what you need." Eisenhower stood and extended his hand. "Keep up the good work, Morrison. You're saving lives and helping us win this war. Don't underestimate the value of that." The expansion began immediately. The facility doubled in size, bringing in instructors from across the Allied forces. Frank found himself managing an organization of over 100 people, a far cry from the solitary truck driver he'd been just 2 years earlier. The administrative burden was exhausting, but he remained hands-on with the training, insisting on personally observing sessions and maintaining quality control. Winter arrived, bringing new challenges. The mountain roads of Italy became treacherous with ice and snow. The techniques Frank had developed needed adaptation for winter conditions, and he worked closely with drivers who'd grown up in cold climates to incorporate their knowledge. A Canadian sergeant named Morrison, no relation despite the shared name, had grown up driving logging trucks in northern Ontario and brought in valuable expertise in winter vehicle operation. Together, they developed winter-specific training modules covering topics like black ice identification, snow traction management, and cold weather mechanical considerations. These modules were rushed into implementation as November turned to December and the Italian winter settled in with fierce intensity. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 tested everything Frank had built. The surprise German offensive in the Ardennes created desperate supply challenges as Allied forces rushed to contain the breakthrough. Frank's techniques were being used by drivers navigating icy roads under combat conditions, trying to keep ammunition and fuel flowing to units engaged in brutal winter fighting. Reports from the Ardennes filtered back to Italy. The Morrison method trained drivers were performing well under impossible conditions, maintaining supply lines that kept the defense functioning. But there were also casualties. Trucks destroyed by enemy fire or accidents on ice-covered roads. Frank felt every loss personally, even though he knew intellectually that the training had saved far more lives than were lost. Colonel Thompson, now serving on Eisenhower's logistics staff, visited the facility in January 1945 with news. The proposal for expanded adaptive operations training had been approved. Frank would be developing training programs for maintenance personnel, supply chain managers, and logistics planners, all using the systematic problem-solving approach he'd pioneered with driver training. "Frank, you're being promoted." Thompson smiled at Frank's confused expression. "Not in rank. You're still a civilian, but in responsibility. You're going to be the senior civilian advisor for the entire Allied Logistics Training Command. It's a newly created position, and it comes with authority to implement training standards across all Allied forces in Europe." "That's a lot of responsibility," Frank said carefully. "I'm just a truck driver, Colonel. I teach people how to handle vehicles. This sounds like it's beyond my expertise." Thompson shook his head. "You're not just a truck driver anymore, Frank. You haven't been for a long time. You're an educator, an innovator, someone who can see problems clearly and develop practical solutions. That's exactly what we need for this position. Will you accept?" Frank thought about Mary back home, about the business he'd left behind, about the normal life he'd once had. Then he thought about all the letters from drivers, all the lives saved, all the potential to expand that impact beyond just vehicle operation. He thought about young soldiers like Kowalski and Peters who'd trusted him to teach them skills that might keep them alive. "I'll accept. When do I start?" In the spring of 1945, as the war in Europe entered its final weeks, Frank finally received orders to return stateside. His work in Italy was done. The training program was established, self-sustaining, integrated into military doctrine. New instructors were teaching the Morrison method to new drivers, and the cycle would continue without him. On his last day at the facility, the staff threw him a small farewell gathering. Sergeant Walsh, now a training officer himself, stood up to speak. Frank Morrison came to Italy as a civilian contractor, just a truck driver doing a job. He could have kept his head down, done his runs, and gone home when his contract ended. Instead, he saw a problem and wouldn't let it go. He taught us that there's no shame in learning, that expertise doesn't come from rank but from experience and the willingness to share it. Every driver who makes it home safely, every soldier who receives supplies because a convoy got through, they owe part of that to Frank. We won't forget it. There was applause, handshakes, promises to stay in touch that everyone knew would be hard to keep. Frank felt the weight of emotion pride mixed with exhaustion and relief that this chapter was ending. He was going home. The journey back to Pennsylvania took 3 weeks, a combination of military transport and Liberty ships crossing the Atlantic. Frank spent the time thinking about what he'd learned, what he'd seen. The war had changed him in ways he was still processing. He'd left as a truck driver and returned as something else, someone who'd proven that practical knowledge and the willingness to teach could make a real difference, even in the chaos of global conflict. His wife Mary met him at the train station in Pittsburgh. She'd aged in the 3 years he'd been gone, worry lines around her eyes, but her smile was the same. They held each other for a long time, not needing words. On the drive back to their home, Mary told him about the business, how his brother had kept it running but was ready to turn it back over. She told him about the town, who'd come back from the war and who hadn't. She told him that he'd received letters from the army, official correspondence that she hadn't opened, waiting for him to read them himself. At home, Frank opened the letters. One was a formal commendation for civilian service. Another was notification that the Morrison method was being incorporated into permanent Army vehicle operation doctrine to be taught at all military driving schools. The third was from General Alexander himself, a personal letter thanking Frank for his contribution and noting that the techniques he'd developed had been used in the final pushes into Germany and had likely saved thousands of lives. Frank sat at his kitchen table, holding these letters, trying to reconcile them with the person he'd been 3 years ago. Just a truck driver. That's all he'd ever claimed to be. But he'd proven that sometimes just a truck driver was exactly what the situation needed. Over the following years, Frank returned to his business, hauling coal and freight through the Pennsylvania mountains. He never talked much about his war service, typical of his generation. But occasionally, veterans would find him, men who'd been trained in the Morrison method or had heard about it from other drivers. They'd thank him, share stories about how the techniques had gotten them through difficult situations. In 1948, Frank received an unexpected visitor. Major Thompson, now retired Colonel Thompson, drove out to Frank's house with a request. The Army was updating its vehicle operation manuals and wanted Frank's input. More than that, they wanted him to consult on training programs for the new vehicles and conditions of the post-war military. Frank considered the offer carefully. He was 52 now, settled back into civilian life, enjoying time with Mary and their children. But he also remembered the letters from young drivers, the knowledge that proper training saved lives. In the end, he agreed to consult part-time, helping update military driving doctrine for the vehicles and challenges of the modern era. The work continued for years. Frank helped develop training programs for the Korean War, adapted his techniques for different terrains and vehicle types, taught new generations of instructors. The Morrison method evolved, but remained grounded in the same principles he demonstrated on that muddy Italian hillside in 1943. Anticipate rather than react. Understand the relationship between vehicle, terrain, and conditions. Work with your equipment, not against it. In 1967, Frank was invited to speak at the Army Transportation School at Fort Eustis. He was 72 years old, still sharp, but feeling his age. A young captain introduced him to an auditorium full of instructors and students, explaining the history of the Morrison method and its impact on military logistics. Frank stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of faces, and felt transported back to that motor pool in Italy, teaching 6 skeptical young soldiers in the rain. The uniforms were different now, the vehicles had evolved, but the fundamental challenge remained the same. How do you move supplies safely and efficiently in difficult conditions? He spoke for an hour, not just about techniques, but about the philosophy behind them, about understanding rather than just following procedures, about adapting to conditions instead of fighting them, about the importance of teaching and learning regardless of rank or experience. When he finished, the auditorium erupted in applause. Afterward, dozens of instructors approached him with questions, many of them veterans who'd used his techniques in Vietnam or other deployments. They shared stories, discussed adaptations they'd developed, asked for guidance on teaching challenges. Frank listened more than he talked, realizing that the method had taken on a life of its own, evolving in ways he'd never imagined. That evening, Frank called Mary from his hotel room. "They still use it. Everything we developed in Italy, they're still teaching it. It's evolved, changed with new vehicles and conditions, but the core is still there. I can't quite believe it." Mary's voice was warm over the phone. "I can believe it. You taught them to think, Frank. That's what good teachers do, and good teaching doesn't expire." Frank thought about that conversation many times in his remaining years. He'd set out to solve a simple problem, how to keep trucks running on mountain roads, but he'd ended up contributing something larger, a way of thinking about challenges that went beyond just vehicle operation. The Morrison method was really about adaptive problem-solving, about understanding systems well enough to work with them efficiently. Frank Morrison passed away in 1979 at the age of 84. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his trucking business and his family, but only briefly noted his war service. Most people in his community never knew the full scope of what he'd accomplished. But at Fort Eustis, at military transportation schools around the world, the Morrison method continued to be taught. New technologies replaced the trucks Frank had known. Computer systems and GPS navigation changed how logistics worked, but the fundamental principles remained relevant. Anticipate, understand, adapt. Work with your equipment and conditions, not against them. Teach others so they don't have to learn everything the hard way. Years after Frank's death, a military historian researching logistics during World War II stumbled across the full documentation of the Morrison method and its impact. The statistics were remarkable. Conservative estimates suggested that the techniques Frank developed had reduced vehicle failures by millions of miles, improved supply efficiency by millions of ton miles, and likely saved thousands of lives both through prevention of accidents and through ensuring critical supplies reached combat units. The historian published a paper that brought renewed attention to Frank's contribution. Military logistics students studied the case as an example of how innovation can come from unexpected sources. Leadership courses used it to illustrate the importance of listening to expertise, regardless of its origin. Frank Morrison became a case study in effective problem-solving and the value of practical knowledge. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from an unexpected source. In 2006, a veteran named James Kowalski, the same kid from Chicago who'd struggled with mountain driving in 1943, attended a reunion of the division that had fought in Italy. He was 81 years old, but his memories of Frank Morrison remained vivid. Kowalski stood up during the gathering and shared his story. How he'd been a terrible driver, how Frank had patiently taught him to think differently about the challenges, how those lessons had carried through not just the rest of the war, but his entire life. He'd become a truck driver himself after the war, eventually running a successful freight company. Every driver who'd worked for him had learned the basics of the Morrison method, though most had never heard the name. "I was scared all the time in Italy," Kowalski told the assembled veterans. "Scared of the Germans, scared of the terrain, scared I'd let everyone down. Frank Morrison taught me that fear was okay, but panic was the enemy. He taught me to break problems down, think them through, trust my training. That's carried me through 60 years of life. When things get tough, I hear his voice telling me to think ahead, read the situation, work with it instead of fighting it. Frank saved my life more than once, and I never got to properly thank him." There was silence in the room after Kowalski finished speaking. Then one by one, other veterans stood up with their own stories. A logistics officer who'd used Morrison's principles to restructure an entire supply chain. a maintenance sergeant who'd adapted the training philosophy to teach equipment repair, a company commander who'd applied the anticipate and adapt mindset to tactical planning. The thread connecting all these stories was the same. A civilian truck driver had seen a problem, developed a solution, and persisted until he could share that solution with others. In doing so, he'd created something that rippled far beyond its original purpose, influencing how people thought about challenges and problem-solving across decades and across countless situations. Frank Morrison never sought recognition or fame. He just wanted to keep trucks running and soldiers supplied. But in pursuing that simple goal with intelligence, persistence, and genuine care for the people he was teaching, he'd made a contribution that outlasted his lifetime and touched thousands of lives. The story of Frank Morrison and the technique he taught the Army is more than just a historical footnote about World War II logistics. It's a reminder that expertise exists in unexpected places, that practical knowledge has tremendous value, and that good teaching can change not just individual lives, but entire systems. It's about the importance of being willing to learn, regardless of whether the teacher wears a uniform or drives a truck. Most importantly, it's a story about seeing a need and stepping up to fill it, about using your skills and experience to make a difference however you can. Frank Morrison didn't have military training or advanced degrees. He just had 20 years of driving trucks through difficult terrain and the willingness to share what he'd learned. That was enough to change history in small but significant ways. The Morrison method is still taught today, evolved and adapted for modern vehicles and conditions, but rooted in the same principles Frank demonstrated on that rainy Italian mountainside in 1943. Every time a military driver successfully navigates a difficult road, every time a supply convoy reaches its destination safely, every time someone chooses to anticipate rather than react, Frank Morrison's legacy lives on. He was just a truck driver who saw a problem and wouldn't let it go. But sometimes that's all it takes to change the world, one technique at a time, one student at a time, one life saved at a time. Frank Morrison proved that the most important battles aren't always fought with weapons, and the greatest contributions don't always come from the places you'd expect. Sometimes they come from a Pennsylvania coal hauler who understood that teaching people to think was just as important as teaching them to drive.